March 1942, North Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles east of Newfoundland. The cold wind cut across the deck of the American merchant ship SS William Clark as Captain James Morrison scanned the dark horizon through his binoculars. It was 2 in the morning. 31 other ships surrounded him in the convoy, their dark shapes barely visible against the black water. 8 of those ships flew American flags. Morrison knew the statistics. 5 Allied ships were being sunk every single day. He knew that somewhere out there, beneath the waves, German U-boats were hunting. This is the story of how a secret Canadian radar network would change everything and save his ship, along with over 1,200 others just like it. The Wolfpack struck at 2:15. 3 torpedoes hit 3 different ships within 5 minutes. Morrison watched the SS Nariva explode in a ball of orange flame that lit up the entire convoy. Men screamed as they jumped into water so cold it would kill them in 15 minutes. The escorts fired their guns into the darkness, but they were shooting at ghosts. The U-boats had already disappeared beneath the surface. By dawn, 8 ships were gone. 214 men were dead. The convoy limped onward, knowing the submarines were still down there, waiting for nightfall to attack again. This was happening everywhere across the Atlantic. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, German U-boats sank 609 Allied ships. The numbers were staggering. Every week, more ships went down. Every week, more food, fuel, and weapons destined for Britain ended up at the bottom of the ocean. The worst area was called the Black Pit, a 600-mile stretch of ocean in the middle of the Atlantic, where aircraft from land couldn't reach, and where U-boats operated with almost complete freedom. The submarines would surface at night, recharge their batteries, and hunt in groups called wolf packs. They were winning the war, 1 torpedo at a time. The Allied navies had radar on their escort ships, but it was almost useless. The radar could only see 5 miles in good weather. In rough seas with waves 30 feet high, it couldn't see anything at all. The U-boats would wait until storms came, then surface and attack while the radar was blind. Naval officers ran calculations showing that to properly protect every convoy, they would need 4 times as many escort ships as they had. Building that many destroyers would take years. The admirals looked at their maps and shook their heads. There was simply no way to cover all that ocean. In a small office in Ottawa, Canada, squadron leader J.S. Booth stared at those same maps with different eyes. Booth was not a naval commander or a submarine expert. He was a meteorologist, a weather forecaster for the Royal Canadian Air Force. His job was to predict storms and wind patterns, not fight U-boats. But Booth had spent months studying weather reports from the North Atlantic, and he had noticed something strange. The U-boat attacks happened in patterns. They weren't random. The submarines surfaced to recharge their batteries in the same zones, night after night, following paths that matched the ocean currents and weather systems Booth tracked every day. Booth brought his findings to a meeting of senior officers in March 1942. He spread his weather maps on the table next to the U-boat attack charts. The patterns matched almost perfectly. One admiral looked at the maps, then looked at Booth. "You're a weatherman," the admiral said. "What do you know about submarine warfare?" Another officer pointed out that long-range air patrols were already searching those areas and finding nothing. A third reminded everyone that the ocean was simply too vast to patrol effectively. They needed their aircraft for bombing missions over Europe, not flying endless circles over empty water. Booth listened to all of this, then asked a simple question. What if we don't patrol randomly? What if we create a fence? The room went quiet. Booth explained his idea. Instead of sending planes to search the ocean, What if they built a chain of radar stations along the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador? The stations would watch the water constantly, 24 hours a day. When a U-boat surfaced to recharge at night, the radar would see it. The stations could warn convoys to change course before the submarines ever got close. The officers stared at him. Build radar stations on land to watch the ocean? One commander actually laughed. "The ocean is too big," he said. "Land-based radar can't reach far enough. You'd need stations every 10 miles for 1,000 miles. It's impossible." But Booth had done the math. The current ship radar could see 5 miles. He knew that newer radar sets, the ones used by coastal defense units, could reach much farther, perhaps 30 miles or more in the right conditions. If they placed stations at Cape Race, Cape Spear, and other points jutting into the Atlantic, they could create overlapping zones of coverage along the shipping lanes. It wouldn't cover the entire ocean, but it would cover the routes the U-boats used most. It would turn the coast into a tripwire. The submarines would have to cross it to reach the convoys. Every senior officer in the room told Booth his idea would never work. The technology wasn't good enough. The cost would be enormous. The military needed its resources elsewhere. Booth left the meeting knowing he would have to prove them wrong. A weather forecaster was about to change naval warfare forever, and the men in that room had no idea what was coming. Booth returned to his small office in Ottawa and locked the door. If the military wouldn't fund his radar fence, he would build it himself and prove it worked. He had 12 technicians under his command, men who maintained weather instruments at remote stations across eastern Canada. He had a budget of 47,000 Canadian dollars meant for updating weather equipment. The military had told him building a proper radar network would cost $2 million. Booth looked at his maps and decided 47,000 would have to be enough. The key was the radar itself. Naval ships used large, heavy radar sets that needed constant maintenance and teams of operators. Booth needed something simpler, something that could run in a remote station with just 2 or 3 men. He found his answer in the ASV Mark II radar, a unit designed for aircraft submarine detection. The military had dozens of these sets sitting in warehouses, replaced by newer models. Booth convinced a supply officer to give him 6 of the old units, claiming he needed them for weather research. It wasn't entirely a lie. He was researching whether radar could watch the ocean from land. The ASV Mark II had a maximum range of about 15 miles when mounted in an aircraft flying at 3,000 feet. Booth needed 35 miles or more. He and his technicians spent weeks modifying the units. They increased the power output. They changed the antenna design to focus the beam across the water instead of down from the sky. They adjusted the frequency to 176 megahertz, which traveled better over ocean waves. The pulse width was set to exactly 2 microseconds, fast enough to separate targets from wave clutter. Each radar could sweep an arc of 120 degrees, like a lighthouse beam sweeping across the dark water. By August 1942, Booth had his first modified radar ready to test. He chose Cape Race, Newfoundland as the location. Cape Race was a rocky point that jutted far into the Atlantic, right on the edge of the main shipping lanes. A weather station already stood there, a small building with 3 men who recorded wind speed and temperature. Booth told his superiors he was installing new weather instruments. He didn't mention the radar. He knew if he asked permission, they would say no. Sometimes it's easier to apologize later than to get approval first. The installation took 2 weeks. The technicians mounted the antenna on a 30-foot tower next to the weather station. They ran cables through the building and set up the radar display in a back room. The entire system drew power from the station's generator. On September 5th, 1942, at exactly 6 in the evening, Booth turned on the radar for the first time. The screen glowed green. A sweep line rotated around the display. At first, it showed nothing but empty ocean. Then, at 28 miles out, a small dot appeared on the screen. The dot moved slowly across the display. It was a ship or something on the surface. Booth's heart pounded. The radar could see 28 miles. It worked. For 2 weeks, the Cape Race station tracked every ship that passed. The operators learned to tell the difference between large merchant ships and smaller vessels. They recorded the range and accuracy of every detection. The radar could spot a surfaced U-boat at 28 miles with 87% accuracy in calm weather. In rough seas, the range dropped to 23 miles, but it still worked. On September 19th, at 11 at night, the radar picked up a contact moving fast at 31 miles out. It was too small to be a merchant ship and too fast to be a fishing boat. The operators called the naval base in St. John's. A submarine had been spotted. The contact was WWII, a German submarine that had sunk 4 ships in the previous week. The naval base immediately radioed a convoy sailing toward the area. The convoy changed course, adding 50 miles to their journey, but staying well clear of the submarine. Every ship in that convoy reached Britain safely. 0 losses. The radar fence had saved its first ships, and nobody in Ottawa even knew the system existed yet. Booth knew he needed support from someone with real authority. He took his results to Air Marshal Lloyd Bredner, the head of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Bredner listened to Booth explain his unauthorized radar station. He looked at the detection logs. He studied the numbers. Most officers would have disciplined Booth for going around the chain of command and spending money without approval. Bredner asked one question instead. How many stations would you need to cover the entire coast? Booth showed him the map. 6 stations would cover the critical zones. 20 stations would create an almost unbroken fence. Bredner made a decision that could have ended his career. He authorized emergency funding and told Booth to build more stations immediately. By December 1942, 6 radar stations were operational, stretching from Cape Race to the coast of Labrador. Each station had 3 operators working in 8-hour shifts, watching the screens 24 hours a day. The stations were connected by telephone lines to naval headquarters. When a U-boat was detected, the information reached convoy commanders within minutes. The results were immediate and dramatic. In the first month of operation, the network detected 14 U-boats. 11 of them were forced to dive and abandon their attacks when aircraft were sent to investigate. 3 convoys were rerouted based on radar warnings. Not a single ship in those convoys was lost, but the losses continued in other areas. In February 1943, German U-boats sank 23 American merchant ships in the North Atlantic. The numbers were getting worse, not better. The Allied command was becoming desperate. In January, a group of U.S. Navy officers traveled to Newfoundland to see Booth's radar network for themselves. They stood in the Cape Race station and watched the screen. An operator pointed to a contact at 26 miles. Submarine, surfaced, heading southwest, he said calmly, as if he was reporting the weather. The American officers looked at each other in disbelief. They could see the submarine on the screen, a tiny dot moving across the dark ocean. One officer grabbed the telephone and called his headquarters. Within a week, the U.S. Navy was asking how quickly the Canadians could build more stations. The weather forecaster's impossible idea was about to change the entire battle of the Atlantic. The numbers told a story that was almost impossible to believe. In the first 3 months of 1942, before Booth's radar network existed, an average of 96 Allied ships were sunk every month in the Canadian operational zone. The convoys would leave port with 40 or 50 ships and arrive in Britain with 30. Captains knew that 1 out of every 5 ships wouldn't make it. Sailors wrote letters home before each voyage, knowing they might not survive the crossing. The ocean had become a graveyard, and the U-boats were the grave diggers. 1 year later, in the first 3 months of 1943, with the radar network watching the coast, only 12 ships were lost per month in that same zone. 12 instead of 96. That was an 87.5% reduction. Thousands of sailors who would have died were still alive. Millions of tons of food, fuel, and weapons reached Britain instead of sinking to the bottom. The radar fence was working beyond anyone's expectations, and now the Allies wanted more of it, everywhere, as fast as possible. The expansion happened at a speed that shocked even Booth. By June 1943, 23 radar stations stretched along a 2,400-mile arc of coastline from Newfoundland down to Nova Scotia and back up to Labrador. Each station needed its own building, its own power supply, and its own team of operators. Factories in Canada and the United States produced 156 modified radar units using Booth's designs. Training centers taught 340 men and women how to read the radar screens and identify targets. The entire network cost just under $400,000, a fraction of what a single destroyer cost to build. The British were trying a different approach at the same time. They sent long-range aircraft on patrols over the mid-Atlantic, trying to catch U-boats on the surface. The planes were effective when they found submarines, but they could only stay in the air for 4 hours before running out of fuel. That meant huge areas of ocean went unwatched for days at a time. The Americans were building destroyer escorts, small warships designed specifically to protect convoys. The destroyers were excellent ships, but they took months to build and didn't start arriving in large numbers until late 1943. Booth's network was operational 6 months earlier and cost 1/8 as much as the destroyer program. The situation before the radar network showed just how desperate things had been. Convoys would sail into the 600-mile mid-Atlantic gap completely blind. They had no idea where the U-boats were. The submarines would track the convoys during the day while submerged, then surface at night when it was too dark for planes to see them. The wolf packs would coordinate their attacks, hitting from multiple directions at once. A typical convoy would lose 5 to 7 ships during each crossing. The escorts would fire their weapons and drop depth charges, but they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. It was like boxing in the dark against an opponent who could see perfectly. The radar changed everything because it turned the lights on. Now, the U-boats couldn't surface anywhere near the coast without being seen. They couldn't recharge their batteries in the shipping lanes. They couldn't coordinate their Wolfpack attacks. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the German submarine fleet, noticed the change immediately. His boats were being detected before they could get into attack position. In April 1943, he sent out a new order to all U-boat captains. They were to transit through the Canadian coastal zone completely submerged, even if it drained their batteries. They were to avoid the radar fence at all costs. The order cut the effectiveness of the U-boat fleet dramatically. Traveling submerged increased transit time by 40%. That meant submarines spent more time traveling and less time hunting. They burned through their battery power faster and had to return to base sooner. By late April, Dönitz made an even bigger decision. He moved his primary hunting grounds away from the Canadian coast entirely, pushing his submarines farther, out into the mid-Atlantic where the radar couldn't reach. The fence had done its job. It had pushed the enemy back. Specific convoys showed just how powerful the system had become. Convoy HX-229 was crossing the Atlantic in March 1943 when the radar network detected 4 U-boats positioning themselves for an attack. The convoy commander received the warning and ordered an emergency course change, adding 2 days to the journey but steering well clear of the submarines. Intelligence officers later estimated that the radar warning saved 11 ships in that convoy. Every one of those ships reached Britain safely and delivered their cargo. The SS Robert E. Peary carried critical supplies destined for the Soviet Union through the northern route. The radar station at Labrador picked up 2 U-boats lying in wait along the ship's planned course. The Peary was rerouted through rougher waters farther north. The journey took longer and the crew endured terrible storms, but the ship survived and delivered tanks and aircraft that the Soviets desperately needed. Without the radar warning, the Peary would likely have been sunk, and those weapons would never have reached the Eastern Front. The official recognition came in waves. In May 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent a personal cable to the Canadian Prime Minister. The message was short and direct. Your fence has closed the gap. The tide is turning. The U.S. Navy formally integrated the Canadian radar network into Atlantic Command's operational structure. American officers began coordinating directly with the radar stations, and U.S. Navy ships started using the Canadian intelligence to plan their patrols. Analysts calculated that the network had protected over 1,200 American merchant vessels from U-boat attacks. At peak operation, the system included 31 stations, staffed by 890 personnel. The stations operated every single day, in every kind of weather. Operators sat at their screens through blizzards and fog, through summer heat and winter ice storms. The radar kept watching. May 1943 became known as Black May in the German submarine service. In that single month, 41 U-boats were sunk by Allied forces. The Germans lost more submarines than they could build to replace. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point, and a weather forecaster's fence of radar beams had helped make it possible. The ocean that had been invisible was now under constant watch, and the hunters had become the hunted. The radar stations kept operating long after the war ended in 1945. The military quickly realized that a network of coastal radar watching for submarines could also watch for aircraft, missiles, and anything else approaching from across the ocean. As tensions grew between the United States and the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, military planners looked at maps of North America and worried about bombers flying over the North Pole. They needed an early warning system, something that could see threats coming from thousands of miles away. The blueprint already existed. It was Booth's fence, just bigger. The radar network evolved into the foundation of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Engineers took the basic principle of overlapping radar stations, creating a defensive fence, and expanded it across the entire northern border of the continent. The distant early warning line, built in the 1950s, stretched from Alaska to Greenland with 63 radar stations watching the Arctic. The technology was more advanced than Booth's modified weather radar, but the concept was identical. Create a fence, watch constantly, warn early. The systems got more sophisticated over the decades, but they all traced back to that first station at Cape Race in 1942. The Navy took the idea in a different direction. If radar could watch the surface of the ocean, could underwater listening devices watch beneath it? In the 1950s, the United States began building SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. Thousands of underwater microphones were placed along the ocean floor, creating a fence of sound instead of radio waves. The microphones listened for the noise of submarine engines and propellers. Just like Booth's radar, the system created overlapping zones of coverage. When a Soviet submarine passed through, the fence heard it. The principles were the same, just underwater instead of above. Squadron leader J.S. Booth received the Distinguished Service Order in 1944 for his contributions to the war effort. The medal came with a certificate citing his innovative work in coastal defense. There was a small ceremony in Ottawa with perhaps 20 people in attendance. No newspapers covered it. The radar network was still classified, still secret. The military didn't want potential enemies knowing exactly how the system worked or where all the stations were located. Booth shook hands with Air Marshal Bredner, accepted his medal, and went back to work. He never sought fame or recognition. He had been a meteorologist before the war, and he wanted to be a meteorologist after it. Booth returned to weather forecasting in 1946. He applied the lessons he learned from radar to a new problem, tracking hurricanes. Weather radar could see storms from hundreds of miles away, giving advance warning before they hit land. Booth helped develop some of the first hurricane tracking systems used in Canada and the United States. He worked quietly in government weather offices for the next 20 years, studying storms and wind patterns. When he died in 1967 at the age of 64, his obituary in the Ottawa newspaper was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned his wartime service in a single sentence that said he contributed to coastal defense efforts. Most people who read it had no idea he had helped save over 1,000 ships. The technology Booth pioneered continued evolving long after his death. Modern maritime radar systems can see over the horizon, detecting ships and aircraft hundreds of miles away using advanced signal processing and satellite data. The United States Coast Guard uses a network of coastal radar stations to watch for drug smuggling boats, using the same fence principle Booth invented. The stations create overlapping coverage zones along the southern U.S. border. When a suspicious vessel crosses the fence, patrol boats are dispatched to investigate. The system stops tons of illegal drugs from reaching American shores every year. Missile defense systems adopted the same approach. Instead of trying to patrol everywhere, modern defense networks create layers of radar coverage that incoming threats must pass through. The system doesn't need to be everywhere at once. It just needs to create a fence that nothing can cross without being seen. Ground-based radar stations, ships with radar arrays, and aircraft with radar pods all work together to create overlapping zones of coverage. The concept scales from watching 100 miles of coastline to watching an entire continent. The broader lesson from Booth's story is about where innovation comes from. The naval experts, the admirals who had spent their entire careers studying submarine warfare, couldn't solve the U-boat problem. They tried building more ships, flying more patrols, and developing better weapons. All of those things helped, but none of them closed the gap. The solution came from outside, from a man who studied weather patterns instead of warfare. Booth saw the problem differently because he wasn't trained to think like everyone else. He asked a question nobody else thought to ask. What if we don't chase the submarines? What if we build a fence and make them come to us? History is full of moments like this. The major breakthrough often comes from the person nobody expected, using an approach nobody considered. Organizations get trapped in their own way of thinking. They try the same solutions over and over, just bigger or faster or with more resources. Real innovation requires someone willing to challenge the basic assumptions everyone else takes for granted. It requires someone brave enough to be told their idea is impossible and build it anyway. Booth was that person in 1942, and the world needed thousands more like him. The lesson applies to challenges we face today. Cybersecurity experts talk about building fences of detection systems instead of trying to defend everything at once. Climate scientists discuss networks of sensors watching for early signs of environmental change. Medical researchers create systems that watch populations for disease outbreaks before they spread. The principle keeps appearing because it works. You don't need unlimited resources. You need smart placement, overlapping coverage, and constant vigilance. You need a fence. The most powerful weapons aren't always the ones that destroy. Sometimes they're the ones that see. Booth understood this in 1942, when everyone else was focused on building bigger guns and faster ships. He realized that winning the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't about sinking more U-boats. It was about knowing where they were. Information was more valuable than firepower. A $47,000 network of modified radar sets accomplished what billion-dollar battleship programs could not. It made the invisible visible. It turned the dark ocean into a watch space where submarines could no longer hide. A weather forecaster built a fence of radar beams and saved over 1,200 American ships. He proved that the best solution to an impossible problem might come from the most unexpected place, built by the most unlikely person, using the simplest idea nobody else thought would work. Sometimes the answer isn't to fight harder. Sometimes it's just to see better.